and this is the elements of a compelling interview. This is a panel that actually took place at our conference in Chattanooga the last time that we met in person, and the panel was so good and so informative, and yet there were several workshops that were competing at the same time. And so it was not seen the way that I had hoped it would be. And I know it wasn't because of the subject matter. It was just a matter of the time of day and everything. So I desired to resurrect this, and I'm so glad that two of my three panelists from the past are here, Lee Zimmerman and Amy Speace, and we're also joined by Michael Stock as the radio DJ. So we're going to be talking about what goes into making a great interview, and we're going to hear from both sides of the aisle, from those that interview artists and write about them or put them on the air, and then Amy will be our artist to answer questions from experience of being interviewed. And Amy, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself? We're going to go around the group.
Okay. Hey, everybody. My name is Amy Speace. I'm a recording and touring singer-songwriter. I've been in making records since 2000. 2006 was my debut record on Judy Collins' Wildflower Records, and I've been touring really internationally ever since then. And I live in Nashville, Tennessee. Thanks for having me.
All right, Michael.
Hey, everybody. I've been a radio DJ now for almost 40 years, around that time, and enjoying folk music. And I seriously started interviewing, I guess, about 15, 20 years ago, when our radio station, WLRN in Miami, changed the format from jazz and reggae, and primarily jazz and reggae, to an all-talk format radio station. Luckily, my show was on weekends, so I was basically ignored. But since we went to an all-talk format, I figured I better start doing more talking. So that's when I started doing a lot of interviews, primarily with artists who are coming to South Florida, and also primarily for my YouTube channel. I like having artists in the studio so I could videotape them and throw them up on my YouTube channel. And I'm still at WLRN. I haven't been doing many YouTube channels because no guests in the studio because of the pandemic. So I've switched over to interviewing artists with new CDs and stuff that interests me. So that's where I stand right now.
Awesome. And Lee Zimmerman, tell us a little about yourself.
You know, when your last name starts with a Z, you're always the last guy. But anyway, it's nice to be here. Thank you for having me. My name is Lee Zimmerman, and I've been a music writer and journalist. Well, since Michael said 40 years, I can say 40 years too without being the only one to age myself here. But write for a number of publications, American Songwriter, Goldmine, Rock and Roll Globe, Bluegrass Today, Living Blues. So, you know, it's quite a varied musical experience for me because I get to go into a lot of different genres. I also have a book. There's the shameless plug right there. I wrote a book last year called Americana Music, Voices, Visionaries, and Pioneers of an Honest Sound. Took me about 6 months to memorize the title. It's not easy. And I am currently doing a podcast with a friend of mine here in East Tennessee called mybackstagepass.com, where we interview artists like Billy Prine, the late John Prine's brother we had on recently, and Charlie McCoy. So that's very exciting too. And I enjoy writing, but I don't like editors. So just so you know.
Okay. Well, I don't think there's any professional
Hopefully
editors
not.
on this panel, but
I get the feeling editors don't like you either.
No, they do. Come on now.
That's funny. Welcome if you came in. We started just 1 or 2 minutes before, but if you have any questions, we have a Q&A box, so you can write your question in the Q&A box and we'll try to get to some of them at the end if we have time. We will really try to have a few minutes for that. Okay, I wanted to start with a really general question. What do you think makes a great interview? Let's start with letter Z.
Oh, great. Well, there is the art of doing a good interview. A subject who is engaged, who is there to obviously promote himself or herself and their new work, but also to engage with the interviewer. One of the things that I really find refreshing is when I'm interviewing somebody and they call me by name. They say, "Yes, Lee," or "Great, Lee," or what, because it makes me feel like they're engaged in the moment with me and that I have their attention and that there's some kind of bond happening. So again, just to sum up, I think an artist who is engaged and talkative and entertaining, that for me makes a great interview. Oh, and that they talk slow, because later I have to transcribe all this, and transcribing can be, yeah, difficult.
That's
So,
a really good
oh,
pointer there.
yes, no, that's definitely something.
Amy, what do you think makes a great interview?
What makes a great interviewer for me is because I'm not the writer, I'm the artist. What makes a great interviewer is somebody who's done their work on me, so that the first part of the interview isn't me telling them my biography, or what I mean, the thing that drives me nuts is when somebody calls me and they want to interview me about a new record and they ask me what my music is like, and then I think, clearly you just got this passed down by an editor and you didn't listen to my music. So, I enjoy conversations, just talking to somebody. There's so much more that interests me in the world besides me. So, I don't really necessarily love talking about me and my music. I love talking about why I make music and what I see in the world that compels me to write about it. And then that ends up being a dialogue between me and another human being, not about me branding myself or trying to promote a book or my record. That always has to happen, but I always try to turn those conversations into something, I guess, more sort of spiritual in a way. And I don't mean spiritual, God spiritual. I just mean, why do we do art? Because the writer is a writer and I'm a songwriter. So I just love that conversation about creativity and the place of the world, place of the creativity in my world and the place of creativity in the writer's world and then in our world. Because I think a great interview that I read is one like Springsteen gives a great interview because he's always trying to inspire people. And if the article can inspire, then I think both the writer and the artist did their job. If the article is just about the next record that I'm making, who produced it, what the songs are, what I wore on the front cover, then I'm not that interested in myself. So yeah. And Lee's a great interviewer because I've
Oh,
worked with him.
check's in the mail, Amy Speace. The check's in the mail. Thank you.
All right. Michael, what do you think makes a great interview?
I've never interviewed Amy. I have interviewed Lee though for when
That's
he
true.
came out with his book. But what makes for a great interview, I think Amy said it, is a conversation that you have. I do not write the interviews, so on the radio they're there and they're gone unless I post them. So it's a lot more free flowing, I suppose, a live interview rather than someone who's going to write down the answers. But it's a conversation. I do some research on the background, but my theory is that most of the people listening to me don't know who the artist is. So it's a challenge to try to get the listener interested in someone they don't know. So it's trying to figure out, how to make the person I'm talking to interesting.
That's a good segue into my next question. How do you, Lee, I'm going to put this to Lee and Michael, how do you prepare for an interview? how do you, what kind of background work do you do? Michael, you can go ahead and continue.
I I get frustrated because right now I'm slated to interview two authors, and I'm not a fast reader. So of course it's better to read the book. But I recently interviewed someone who wrote Jacksonville and the Roots of Southern Rock, and got as far as the introduction because I only had less than a week to interview him. But I try to figure out what would be interesting to me for interesting. So, for instance, I asked him about the relationship between the Dixie flag, the Confederate flag, and Southern rock, and I know there's a good relationship there, and to see how he addressed that relationship. I interviewed Anita Franco recently, and I found out through her website that she was attending the Women's March in Washington, D.C. So I asked her about that. What's current? What's happening now, being in the moment? And I asked her if she's ever confronted anybody who wasn't wearing a mask. And I enjoyed her answer. She said no, because she's not confrontational. And we pointed out in the interview that she's fearless, but she's not confrontational. So was that the answer to the question? I can't remember what the question was.
Sure. Lee, how do you prepare for an interview?
Well, I guess it starts when the publicist will send me a press release. I always ask them for a bio. In most cases, I'm familiar with the artist. It's very rare that I interview somebody that I'm not aware of, because I usually pitch these to an editor because I have that interest. Sometimes somebody asks me to do an interview, so I have to do a little more research. I'll go to Wikipedia, I'll go to their website. Obviously, I will listen to the new record. And if I'm not as familiar as I should be, I'll listen to older records as well. But it's always interesting to me, as has been mentioned before, not to ask cut and dry questions like, you did this, when did you do that? For example, the other day I interviewed a fellow named Jock Bartley, who's with the group Firefall, some of you may remember. And I read in his bio that he had been managed by Mick Fleetwood of Fleetwood Mac. And I thought that was an interesting point to bring up. And it started a whole new line of conversation. And it became very anecdotal. And when you can bring out little known facts like that, that people might not be aware of, I think that enhances the story and makes it something more than just, here's their bio, here's their new record. Let's really get personal. And as Amy said before, talking about topical subjects as well. I mean, obviously, we're all in the midst of this pandemic, so it's good to find out how people are dealing with it. And, you know, sometimes we get political, but sometimes we just talk about things in general. But I think that brings a little bit of humanity to the story, and I like to do that as well.
Amy, what kind of, or how do you get mentally prepared for an interview, and what kind of questions interest you, and what kind of questions are off-putting?
I don't prepare mentally for interviews, to be honest. I just sort of, I mean, my publicist and my manager would love me to just, you know, memorize the bio and memorize the PR piece so that we know what we're pointing at. Yeah, I was just talking to my publicist for this next record because they want to pitch a different side of the story than's been pitched, and to kind of expand the story. And I said, great, you guys do that, because, you know, so I don't prepare. I answer the questions truthfully as I feel fit. That's because that's the kind of artist I am. I'm a pretty honest, vulnerable, truthful artist. I don't have a stage front. So I try to come at it just as like me. And this is, you know, I think of myself as a writer, as a songwriter, not as a entertainer. But the questions that are off-putting are always the same. It's, how old are you?
Oh.
And I'll tell you, it's because men are never asked that. And so that always puts me off. And I always give a glib answer, like somewhere between 25 and 75. And then, you know, sometimes people will say, oh, that's really funny. Anyway, how old are you? And I'm like, anyway, really between 25 and 75. When it's a gender when it's a gender conversation that has nothing to do with the music, it tends to put me off. But in this folk world, in folk and Americana, that never happens. In interviews in Europe or in the UK, that never happens. It rarely, I should say it rarely happens. Otherwise, I know when certain subjects may be, when somebody asks me, is this song about your life? I may or may not answer that question, depending on my comfort level of the story of mine that I wish the narrator, like I'm the narrator of my own life, but I'm also the narrator of my music, and where autobiography and storytelling mesh is my choice. And really, I don't want to tell you what the song is about. That's another thing. I really want the listener to know what the song is about, because that, you write from, a lot, there's a saying, the more specific we are, the more universal the song is. So I try to get really specific when I'm writing and crafting the song, but I'm doing that not to share my life, more so that you see your life in my song. And so when somebody says, oh, is this song specifically about this or that, I try to kind of divert the conversation to, well, what do you think the song is about? Or somebody might take it this way. I'm not a confessional artist. I'm a storyteller. So I hope that answered the question. But I also love being interviewed, because it's just like Michael said, for me, it's an opportunity to have a friendship develop out of that moment. Hopefully I get to know something about the interviewer as well as they get to know something about me, so that when I do see them in the hallway at Folk Alliance, I can hug them or thank them for their time, because it really means a lot to me if somebody wants to interview me. I want to give them the time that they need, because they're helping me sell the record. So we need each other, really.
Awesome. Awesome. Hey, okay, so I was wondering if each of you could tell me your best interview you think you ever did, or somewhere in the ballpark, and your worst interview. And of course, for the men, the ones you've interviewed, who was the best or worst, and Amy, maybe your experience of who interviewed you, which was best or worst. So, Michael, why don't we start with you?
It's hard for me to say. I've done so many, although I think I'm pretty confident saying all my interviews I've done in the past 5 years are much better than any interviews I've done in 35 years before that. And I think I always like to think that my latest interview is my best. I just interviewed a trio, the Lubin brothers this morning, which is a trio of fellows, identical trios out from West Palm Beach. And I always try to think of how I could approach the interview that would be interesting and different. And I asked them about them living in the same town and being identical triplets. I thought that was interesting. I recently had an interview with an author of a children's book, or they call it a picture book, on blind Willie Johnson. And I asked him, I thought was an interesting question, why do African Americans not take to the blues as a genre in general, as much as it used to be in the past? And he related an interesting story about how when Jimi Hendrix, right after Woodstock, played to a blues society in New York City, and he was basically booed off stage. And it took a blues singer woman, the interviewer didn't remember his name, but it took this woman to bring Hendrix back on stage and convince the stuck-up crowd that Hendrix was playing music that 50 years ago would have been booed off stage too, and now we look at as being classic. So he won over the crowd on that second playing at the Blues Society. But as far as my best interviews, I remember interviewing Richie Havens and Leo Cocky on the same day. I don't remember what I said, but just having those people in the studio, I thought was pretty thrilling. So I'll leave it at that. I'll leave it at that.
Is there an interview that you can remember where the person was very difficult to interview?
I prefer to have interviews live in the studio with me. So, and it's interesting, I'm just going to mention Terry Gross, who does Fresh Air, who does some of the most fantastic interviews. She prefers to have people on the phone, even if they're in the same building, she won't be in the same room with them. And also I once was engineering for an interview with Terry Gross, And the interview went on for like 45 minutes. And the interview that was ended up on air, on Fresh Air, was only 10 minutes long. So no matter what you say in these interviews, it could be edited and altered to however the interviewer wants. But I once interviewed a gentleman who had this nasty habit of I'm not sure what you call it, but every time he answered a question, he'd start it like this. And it was just a habit. And apparently nobody ever told him about it. So I was the first one to, and this was a gentleman and his college graduate and head of the society. And I had to spend an hour editing out all these that he included in this thing. And when you do it live, you can't help but air the uhs and the ums. I'll mention real quick, Abby, that I'm a big fan of Toastmasters. And if you're not familiar with Toastmasters, you could just Google it and you'll probably have a meeting in town that you could enjoy, that you could go to and learn how to speak correctly. You more directly, how to organize your thoughts and how to answer questions a little bit better if you're being interviewed. Another time I interviewed Guy Clark, just to throw out a name. It was a phone interview. And every question I asked him, he just went, yep, nope. So you gotta, that was probably my worst interview. It was great. Guy Clark was great music, but he didn't do anything else, didn't do anything good for his image on my show there.
That's funny. Hey, Lee, how about you?
Well, first of all, Amy Speace is a wonderful interview. And I'm not just saying that, but it's obvious in what she was saying that she does a wonderful interview. You know, I often get intimidated before I do an interview. I'm afraid I'll get mumble mouth or I'll say something stupid or, you know, so I have a little bit of apprehension. So the best interviews are the ones where they make me feel at ease. For example, I'm going to drop a couple of names. 2 weeks ago, I interviewed John Fogerty. And interviewing a legend is, first of all, you're awestruck because you literally worship these people and you admire them and you have for so long. So I didn't know what to expect. Sometimes you'll be cued in like, well, be careful. He doesn't do this. He doesn't do that. I was told that John Fogerty likes to talk, and talk he does like to do. And he was so gracious and down to earth and genuine. And it was a wonderful, wonderful interview. I sometimes interview people where I get off the phone and I feel like, oh my gosh, I've bonded. We're going to be lifelong friends. For example, quick anecdote. I once interviewed Art Garfunkel, and I thought it was a great interview. And at the end, he said, well, Lee, I've got to go. I'm taking my kids to see the movie Gravity, which was out at the time. 2 weeks later, he was in town in South Florida, and we went to the backstage entrance, waited for him. We were told, well, Arthur is going back to his hotel, but we happened to stick around. We were speaking with another couple. So after everybody's left, except for us and this other couple, he makes an appearance at the stage door. And I go up to him, Artie, remember me, Lee? And he's like a deer in headlights, like that. And that was very disappointing, obviously. So, but now we'll get to the worst interview of all time. And the winner of that is Brian Wilson of the Beach Boys, who, when you speak to him, you literally have to lead him on every question. Like you'll say something like, Caroline, no, what a beautiful song that was, Mr. Wilson. And he'll go, yeah, that was a good one. Okay. Or you say something like, you know, the Beach Boys were so influential. And he'll go, yeah, the Beach Boys were really influential. He kind of talks like this too. And then, you know, it's just going nowhere. And after 7 minutes, he says, okay, I got to go now. Bye. And I've interviewed him twice, and both times, not very good. So there are some dramatic examples of the trauma of being an interviewer and what you have to deal with.
Okay. Amy, what was your best and worst experience being interviewed?
Okay, so my two best, and I wish I remembered her name, was for All Things Considered at NPR, and it was a weekend show. And I have her name somewhere, but it was so fascinating because it was on my record, How to Sleep in a Stormy Boat, which was a record inspired by Shakespeare characters. And before we did the interview, they had gotten actors from the Actors Theater in Washington, D.C. to speak monologues of each part of Shakespeare's plays that inspired the song that they played. And then she asked me my experience with that character and where I was coming at in writing the song, which was like deep dive and also a complete surprise to me. P.S. also shared the elevator with Robert Redford on that day, so it was a really good day for me. Yeah,
Wow.
and he just sort of looked me up and down and said, "How do you do?" And I was like, "I'm fine, Mr. Redford. How are you?" So that was a good day. But the one I think I was really I've been interviewed by so many people who are so wonderful from small papers. I mean, I remember being interviewed from a guy not in Murrayville but in Knoxville who just had a great conversation, and we've kept in touch. But you
Wayne
know,
Bledsoe. Wayne
that's
Bledsoe.
it. That's it. I love that guy.
Yeah.
But you know, I get interviewed by people who intimidate me, like Anthony DeCurtis or Dave Marsh, or and then my favorite one of them was Pete Fornatale, the late Pete Fornatale from the New York City radio scene, who is a legendary DJ. And it was when I was just starting to work with Judy Collins, and he was doing a whole series on Judy Collins, and I was Judy's mentee, and so she brought me in, and so he did a whole series. He did this whole show on me. And of course, I'd been listening to his radio show for years, so I was really nervous. Well, the first thing he said to me, which is crazy, he had somehow found my college thesis, which you just don't, it's not like it's out there, right? I went to Amherst College. Must have called Amherst. My college thesis was on it was basically about Billie Holiday, but about writing autobiography when the autobiography is handed to you in a culture that is trying to create image that is not the truth, but glorifies the tragedy. I mean, it was like a meta. It was like very like, you know, senior in college, I think I'm smarter than I am kind of thing. But he was fascinated by how did this white folk girl find her way to Billie Holiday, and had that at all influenced my music because I had done a deep dive on Billie Holiday. And I'll tell you, first of all, I was completely flattered that anybody would A, figure out that I went to college and wrote a thesis, B, read the damn thing, quote it back to me, and ask me how, you know, how me looking at her autobiography had anything to do with me coming into this world as an entertainer and having to kind of put my own autobiography out there. It was just like, it was like way over my pay grade. I gotta tell you, that man was smart, smart, smart. But I loved it, and I loved how just how interested and interesting he was. That was a really fascinating conversation. Please do not find my thesis. It's just, I reread it and I was like, oh no, this is not so good, not very good. But I tried. Anyway, the worst one, we'll never remember his name. It was in Germany. I think it was in Stuttgart, but I'm not sure. I was whisked into like the top 40 rock station. And in Germany at the time, they thought of me as a country artist, like full on. People would come to my shows in nudie suits with big hats, wanting to two-step. And if you know my music, it's a lot of sad, like long versed, you know, wordy ballads. And so it was just baffling to me. But anyway, this guy didn't speak English very well. And so you have this sort of loud monster truck and tractor pull voice that's going, you know, and then he introduces me and says, rock artist, Amy Speace. And I said, and I was like, I don't know what I'm supposed to say. And I said, well, I'm actually an Americana folk artist. He goes, oh, Americana, like Bryan Adams. And I just said, yes, thank you. And I just let it. I was like, I don't know what he said about me, but clearly he had not ever listened to my music. And I was, I was, I was happily put in line with Bryan Adams that day. It's never happened since. So,
Well, there could be a worse artist, I guess, to
oh no,
be thrown in with.
listen, no big deal. I mean, like my whole high school life was Bryan Adams. I'm all about that music, but I do not live in that world. So that was funny.
Are you sure you didn't say Ryan Adams? Because he would have
That's
been
what
more important.
that's actually what I said. I said, "Oh, do you mean Ryan Adams?" Because actually, yes. And he said, "No, Bryan Adams. You know, David Hasselhoff, Bryan Adams." And I went, "Oh God, it's Germany. I'll
Oh,
just let it
no.
be."
I wanted to talk a little more about the technical side. Lee, what medium, you've told us, that you do mostly print and stuff, but what is the technical side of how you interview people, and what kind of tools do you use? And
Well, I have a digital recorder, which I can hook up to my landline, and I tape the conversation as it unfolds. The most difficult part of an interview, and this is not to negate the challenge of doing a good interview and having a great conversation, but technically the most difficult part is transcribing the interview, because I'm very slow. So I'm listening to the tape, and after every few words, I'm stopping the recorder and typing in. And it literally takes hours, but I'm very precise because I want to get every word correct and every nuance. So it is difficult. Now, I know there's opportunity to do interviews on Spotify, but being the technical illiterate that I am, I'm not sure how I would hook up my little digital recorder to do that. Now, I know there are some programs that will translate for you, but I don't know. I haven't investigated, and I think they might be cost prohibitive, because what we writers get paid, you will lose money to have somebody transcribe it. But that's really the way we do it. When I do my podcast, obviously, like Michael here, it's very live in the moment. So there's nothing to write down, but you have to have your questions ready and that sort of thing. And then I have a partner in that. His name is Billy Hubbard, a dear friend. And the biggest challenge there is not talking over one another, which, as you can imagine, I'm pretty guilty of talking over people. Yeah, I am. Yeah.
have you ever had a technical challenge and
Oh,
is there
yeah.
any advice about how to avoid something like that, or what
Well,
was the
okay, yeah.
experience?
The first cue, when you get the person on your phone, turn on the digital recorder. I literally have had, not often, because I don't want to just see, I'm making myself sound like an idiot here, okay. But there have been one or two times when, for whatever reason, I didn't turn on my digital recorder, and I literally had to remind myself, remember what was said in bits and phrases. I used to do interviews where, and many newspaper reporters do this. I saw friends of mine do this. They would write down whatever that person said. They would sit there doing shorthand. And I did that for a long time. I don't know how I did it though, but I did it. I mean, then the challenge is reading my own handwriting, because that's a bear to begin with. But no, I mean, there have been times when I had my little digital recorder, and in the middle of the interview, the batteries were low. It died. Oh my gosh. These are nightmare scenarios, and you're bringing them up now, Abby, and I'm feeling a little bit distraught here just thinking about these technical
That's
challenges.
funny. This is why I don't do many interviews, because I had
No,
something
I'm
similar
glad
happen to
you
me.
admit it.
No,
I like to, I
I
like
had
an
something
open
similar
book.
happen to
I like an
me.
open book. So
It took one time for me to be like, should I really be doing this?
no, you're doing great, actually.
Well, yeah, okay. Michael, same question.
I don't know much about tech stuff. In fact, I feel like right now I'm behind because I'm still doing phone interviews when most interviews are on Zoom right now. But I still have scheduled phone interviews in the studio. I have forgot to turn on the recorder once. I mean, you just brought to mind John Fahey. I did that a long time ago. That's probably the first and last time I did that. So technically, I rely on the radio station, and I don't have to transcribe because
Lucky you.
I'm lazy, I suppose.
Do you pre-record your interviews and then edit, or do you do them live mostly?
If I do prefer to do it live in studio, like I say, for videotaping for my YouTube channel. But if I'm not going to do it live, I do prefer to do it on phone, and then it gives me an opportunity to edit. A lot of people use, bringing up Toastmasters again, a lot of people use uh, joiner words or crutch words like or and there's I joke, I used to work at a radio station in Miami called WDNA, and I felt like changing the words to WNDA because this one disc jockey must have said "and" about 20 times in a period of 3 minutes. So and also so I do prefer to do live interviews because it's much more spontaneous, and it's you can't go back when you do when you do live interviews. But I feel like I'm under a lot more pressure when I do pre-recorded interviews because I do have the opportunity to edit and take out mistakes and joiner words and make it sound a lot snappier and quicker. So it's I guess for posterity, it's better to have the opportunity to edit and manipulate the interview rather than do it live. But I do enjoy doing it live. I will say quickly too, another thing that Toastmasters I mentioned also, I did a little bit of improv comedy. It wasn't really comedy, but when you're at an improv class, you learn to be a much better listener. And that's what it comes down to. When you want to have a conversation, when you're doing an interview, you could have like 5 or 6 questions or 10 questions, but most of the interview happens by responding to what the artist is saying. You kind of build on what you're listening to, rather than be so stuck into what you're doing. You follow to where the path is going. Every once in a while, I get bored. I figure if I'm bored, the listener's bored, and that's when I change the subject. I have been called out on that a few times and said that people were interested in when I change the subject, but that's the way it goes.
All right. Amy, what kind of medium of interview do you enjoy the most? Live, pre-recorded, or just conversing with someone who might write about you? And what kind of technical nightmares have you encountered?
I don't think any really, except when I'm being interviewed when I'm on the road, and it has, I a lot of times people would want me to be at a landline, and that's impossible because I'm driving from one place to the other. So, and especially in Tennessee, there's people who want to catch me, and I'm like, I'm in the mountains between, where from like Knoxville to Asheville, and it's like, I can't count on cell reception. I do try to, when I do interviews from the road, I try to pull over. That is one thing I've learned is do not answer questions when you're driving, because you're not in charge of what you're saying. And also I'm personally a terrible driver when I'm answering questions about my own record. But I've done all of them. Somebody just asked on the Q&A and I answered them if I preferred email interviews to being, because I've had that happen where the person can't catch me. We can't, set up a phone interview. So they send me email questions. And, I like that sometimes if I have time, because then I have more time to think about the answer rather than just be spontaneous. But I also did improv comedy, Michael Stork. So I'm totally on board with the improv. I teach performance, and I tell everybody, singer-songwriters, I'm like, go take an improv comedy class. That's all you need to know about being on stage is, and it's true also in interviews, because if you can respond on a is spontaneously, in a kind of honest way, and bring yourself fully to it. Bring the full, force of your personality and your intelligence and your curiosity, really about yourself. I think it makes a compelling conversation between two people. And so I don't like, that's why I say I don't prepare. I want to know what they have to bring to the table, so that's going to springboard the conversation. Even if they do start with, because everybody has to, like, here's the record that you're promoting. Like, my last one was called Me and the Ghost of Charlemagne, and it was always like, what is that song about? Why Charlemagne? But I have a story that's true, that goes for my banter to the song, but also I think sheds light on why I wrote the record and why that track was so important to me. And so if I tell the story of that song, I think it springboards a further conversation about what life on the road is like, what life in the industry is as a woman over 40, what life in the singer-songwriter touring world is like as a mother. There's so much that kind of evolves out of, I wrote a song about wanting to quit this job because I was tired of the road. And I wrote a song called Me and the Ghost of Charlemagne, which was about wrestling with wanting to bail and just stay home. Of course, you write a song like that and then that doesn't happen. And then you're on the road twice as much as you were before. But it starts a cool conversation, and it just leads all over the place. Technology for the artist, I think AirPods are great. I also have USB mics. I do a lot of home recording, so I have my own studio. This is pretty much where it lies, and I just kind of pull it out of the closet. But I have a really good USB mic, an Apogee, that I use, because it'll catch, and it won't catch all the rest of the world sounds, because I do have a 2.5-year-old who likes to scream and cry. So if I'm doing an interview, I like to stay in my little bubble. So that doesn't, because the interviewer is recording it, and if I have to be going, listen, screaming off mic to my kid, it's not going to be great for them to transcribe that.
Well, I've had that
Or
happen.
maybe.
It's all right. It's all right. It's interesting. And
Huck makes an appearance once in a while. Yeah.
Makes it colorful.
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, I was wondering, how do you deal with the element of promotion? Obviously, artists need to promote themselves, and how does self-promotion ever go too far, or do you try to give them time for that? I guess that was all over the place. Lee, any thoughts?
On the element of surprise, I'm sorry.
Self-promotion.
Self-promotion. All right.
Are there any shameless self-promoters
There,
that
of
just
course
went
there
too
are. And
far?
let's face it, that's the whole point of why an artist is doing an interview, really. If you watch any of the late night talk shows, the guests that they have on Kimmel or Colbert, they're not there just because they want to do it. They have something to promote. So it's the same in our industry as well. And of course, it's very important to make sure that's front and center. And for that, I rely on the publicist to get me the music, to get me the background on the album. And I'm fortunate to deal with some great publicists. I know Jill Kettles is listening in right now. Here's the plug for Jill. She's wonderful. But there are a lot of really wonderful publicists that I've developed a relationship with over the years. And obviously their job is to get the artist to the interviewer, to get them into publication, and to make mention of the new record. Now, nowadays also we have these streaming concerts that we're talking about. A lot of artists are releasing singles as opposed to albums. So there are a lot of different avenues that, because of the pandemic and the lack of road work, that the artists and the publicists are anxious to make note of with the writers. So I'm very cognizant of that, and I respect that. And while I don't want to make the entire story about the new album, I want to go into background and history and that sort of thing. But I know that front and center you want to mention the album, and you want to talk about the songs and who's on it, and that sort of thing. I do a kind of hybrid format sometimes for American Songwriter, where it will be a combination of an album review and a short interview with the artist based around the new album. And that's kind of interesting too, because it's very focused and it's very centered. It's not just an album review, but it's the artist giving input into that album and kind of the inspiration and the backstory. So I like doing that. And it's very, very cool to do it. My editor likes it too. Dallas, you like it, don't you? Thank you. We don't know if Dallas is watching.
All right. Michael, how do you help artists promote themselves, and do you have any interesting experience to share?
Well, ultimately, the purpose of the interview is to promote the artist. And I think we're clear on that. And during the pre-interviews, I go through what is it the artist wants to promote specifically, if there's something I cannot talk about, or if something specifically the artist wants to talk about. I have come across some artists who are a little bit overboard with self-promoting, and it turns into a joke, more or less. I call it out, and sometimes it gets on the obnoxious level, but maybe that happened maybe once or twice. And I always ask the artist, I mean, it is a folk music show, that's the format, but when it comes to promoting the artist, it's up to them. I mean, I'm there as a vehicle for them. I ask them what songs do they want to promote, even if it doesn't fit the format. It's their butt on the line. And they're more or less showcasing. I'm there to showcase them. That's the purpose of it, is to promote the artist. And as long as they're not too forward about it, I'm all for it.
Amy, how do you approach promoting yourself? I remember at the beginning of the interview, you mentioned it a little bit already, said that it wasn't your primary interest when you were having an interview, but how do you feel about it?
Well, no, I mean, of course, if I'm promoting an album, I'm promoting something that I want to sell. And so, we're all real clear that I have a record that, somebody, either I or a record label, has invested in, and they've invested in order to sell it. In order to sell the record, they have to sell me. I kind of don't like, I mean, whatever. As I love it and I don't love it. I don't know if there's an artist. I'm sure there are artists out there that absolutely 100% love it, but I think everybody has a little bit of an uncomfortable relationship with the narcissistic dance that we have to do as artists. We have to be super interested in ourselves, and also healthy Amy likes to think that there's definitely an overboard with that. And so I'm very aware, having a publicist and having bio writers and people like that there's a narrative to be crafted. My old manager used to say there's an NPR pitch, and it really doesn't have to do with the music. It has to do, what is it, why you? Because there's a lot of people that write music and there's a lot of people that write folk music, but why me? What's the thing about me that makes me interesting, that makes my music interesting, and that there's sort of a holistic picture around that? And that, I guess, is called branding. It's an ugly word for me. It just makes my skin crawl, but there's a brand involved. And so I'm aware of it, so that when I'm in an interview situation, what I'm talking about sort of furthers that and doesn't put off a false narrative. Or like if I was Lady Gaga, it'd be completely, that's a whole different level of artistry. But like, I know the marks, the points in an interview that I want to make. What are the 3 songs that I want to talk about? What is coming up in my world that is important to talk about, whether it's a festival that I'm doing or a television show or the next record that I'll be promoting. Where am I touring? I was born in Baltimore. I lived in New York City for 20 years, and I was an actress in the classical theater world. That's always a piece of the story, because I think that speaks to, and my being a playwright, that speaks to the kind of songs that I write and the way that I come at it as a songwriter. Judy Collins will always be mentioned in every single interview I ever do, because she's who discovered me. Oh my God, I'm so happy to talk about my origin story with Judy Collins, because I'm like forever humbled and grateful that she found me and changed my career. And also, like, with an interviewer, I've been doing this for 20 some years, and I've been really, really lucky in my career. And I've had a lot of extraordinary opportunities. Um, and a lot of them wouldn't have happened but for the attention of people in the press and radio. And I'm really aware of that. And so I try to stay, this is going to sound like super Pollyanna, but I really do try to stay very grateful while I'm doing that, because I know I've seen a lot of people walk through interviews and they're just pitching the thing they're pitching, and they're going from one person to the next saying the same thing. And I've always wanted to really take in every single moment as extraordinary, because who knows, like, the next record I make, maybe nobody writes about it, and that might happen. And so in the moment that I'm being interviewed, I never want to take that for granted and say, oh my God, I'm better than this, or, ugh, I answered that question last interview, couldn't you have read that? To me, it's just like, God, thank you so much for even paying attention. Because for the most part, as artists, we're like in our bedrooms writing these songs, hoping anybody listens. So, no matter if it's your local paper or the college radio station that's on 88.1, and the program is Sundays from 11 to 2, and there's, 5 listeners in your small town, or it's, WNYC or NPR, it doesn't matter. It's the same conversation. And yeah, and I have a record coming out in April, and I'm starting this thing right now. And it's like the pandemic has given me, before the pandemic shut down, I was in England, and I was getting an award, which was the biggest moment of my career. It was incredible. And it was my song, Me and the Ghost of Charlemagne, won International Song of the Year for the UK Americana Music Association. Brought my mom. It was a whole big deal. I got to meet Nick Lowe. The milk carton kids gave me my little award, and everybody around me was like, this is going to change everything. Everything's going to open up now. Isn't this amazing? And boom, then the
Wow.
world shuts down, and the record didn't sell. Not because I didn't work hard, but because the world stopped. And so coming back, so I've had, almost a year off of the hamster wheel of the publicity game. And what have I done? I've written a shit ton of songs. I've made 2 records, excuse my shit, I've made 2 records. I've been writing all the time, and I'm kind of walking right back into it with a publicist. But I have a different mindset these days, because it's like this pandemic has given us all this opportunity to kind of go, why do we do this? There's not much money in this game, for the most part. So you have to do it because you absolutely love it, and you have a greater mission than just promoting yourself. Like, I write songs to express how I feel, to heal myself, so that hopefully somebody else hears their story in what I have written, but also somebody else hears their story in my own narrative. And they get to take my record and like cry with my record after a breakup, like I wept like a baby with Patty Griffin's records. So, and I got to meet her and say, thank you so much or Sean Colvin, thank you for making Steady On. That was the soundtrack to my life when I was, 19. And the only reason I knew that is because somebody wrote about Sean Colvin, and I went and bought the record. So it really is, we're all in this dance together. And so to stay in the moment and stay open and present and stay grateful for any bit of publicity somebody gives you. It's always fascinating to me when I get a call from somebody who says, I loved your record and I want to talk to you about it. I'm like, oh my God, thank you.
Wow. That's great advice. I was going to ask for one piece of advice from each of you, and you're welcome to give another, but that's such great advice there, just staying grateful for those
That's
opportunities.
stay grateful and stay, and I think stay true. And don't, people say don't read your own press. I say read it. I read my own press. But there are some reviews of my records that have been like, I've read a couple people, say, oh, I didn't like it when she went soft. I liked her when she was more rock hard, Lucinda Williams with the big band, and when she went solo folky, I mean, and I could have taken that personally, but that's one person's opinion. So I read my own press, and I also recognize that a review is one person's opinion. So there's a difference between press and review. Like a conversation with Michael on the radio And an interview with Lee for an article is going to be different than me getting a 3-star or a 5-star or a 1-star review. Reviews, I try to keep a real, I let my manager read reviews, but I'll read the interview because I had an enjoyable time talking to them, and I'm curious how they wrote it. And I always try to, I don't always do it because I forget, but I always try to write back after I see the press, because they'll send it to me. I try to write the interviewer and tell them that I read it and how I felt about it. And usually it's just always like, thank you so much for your time. So just stay gratitude. Yeah.
Wow, Lee, what one piece of big advice would you give to people that are gonna seeking
Well,
interviews?
well, first of all, there's no money in it, so don't expect to get rich. The book, I had negative income from it this year, I kid you not. So you're not doing it for the money, but I do it, and I think most people do it because they're fans and they love the music, and to be able to speak to an artist that you admire and that influenced your life, I mean, it's just the greatest feeling. So I guess, you know, advice, embrace it, love it, and feel fortunate because your friends are going to envy you. You know, you say, oh, I interviewed so and so. Just realize what a privilege it is that you have. And for a writer such as myself, or I would dare say with Michael, to be able to share your thoughts and express your feelings about this music to whoever is picking up on it, that's a very, very powerful and very valuable position to be in, because you know, how many of us get the opportunity to do that? We go on Facebook and the social media, but to really be writing something or broadcasting something where people are listening or people are reading, that's a very special privilege. Don't take it lightly, and really cherish it and know that it's important. Yeah.
Michael, any advice?
I agree with Amy and Lee. I am very grateful that I have this opportunity to talk with musicians that I am admired of. One advice I have, I guess I learned this a few years into my career, is don't say no to anything. If someone offers you something, just say yes and go with it. And you might freak out or you might have self-doubt, but just be yourself. And that has always got me through the hardest times.
That's awesome. We have a couple of questions that have been written in the chat. I have one that says, do you have an agenda when you begin your interview and stick with it, or do you go with the flow? I guess that would be more to Lee or Michael.
All right. Well, I used to write down questions religiously. I used to have my whole interview written out question by question. And I still write down a few bullet points, but I find that the best interviews are, as Amy said before, conversations. And it's not just, how did you do this? What do you think of this? When you can have a conversation, so much more comes out. And most importantly, the artist's personality comes out. And that's really what I want to convey. I want to share something of the artist. So, you know, as I said before, I do my preparation, but nowadays I don't have, excuse me, have every question written out. I have a few key things I want to touch on. And I find that in just this free flowing conversation, when I look back on the things I might have noted earlier, I've covered them all because it came out so naturally. And it works pretty well. I enjoy that. Yeah, good bond.
I generally,
Go ahead, Michael.
okay. I generally do my research, read the book or the press releases, and then add my questions. And then when the interview starts, it usually goes all out the window. And I do go with the flow. I try to be humorous in my questions, or not off-putting, but I try to ask questions that you don't get in a normal interview. In fact, I even had someone once thought I had Asperger's because of the strange questions I asked. And some artists even are scared of the questions I'm going to ask, which I don't get. But If an artist doesn't like a question I ask, it's easy enough to say, I don't want to answer that. So it's,
Amy, have you ever had an interviewer try to kind of keep you in a box, and how do you deal with that?
Gosh, I don't think so. I don't think I can't. There's always I mean, I can, every interview will always have like I said, they'll ask the Judy Collins question, or, the interviews that ask me stock standard questions like lyric or music's first, those are, I mean, that's kind of an old joke that we all, musicians always say, did you get that one? It's like, but I do think like some people are really interested in the writing process. And so I do think that some artists can be real snobby about the interview questions they're getting. That's because they've done so many interviews and answered it so many times. But what they don't realize is that person has never had an opportunity to actually sit and talk to you, and they love your music and they are super curious. Do you write the lyrics or music first? And so, I try to stay in that world. There's the interviewer that at the end of the interview, they always ask if there's anything else that was left that you have to say that didn't get covered. I always think that that's a beautiful question, because say they didn't ask you what's next coming up in your career, and you're really excited because not only are you promoting this record that just came out, you just finished a book that now is like the thing that excites you the most. Or for me, after I finished this record, I made the record when I was pregnant. So, is there anything else you want to talk about? I'm like, can we please talk about my son Huckleberry, because he was born right as I was promoting the record. So like, there's always the thing that I think would be something I want to talk about, because it doesn't have anything to do with the music, but it sort of sheds a little bit more light on what is important to me in the world. And being a new mother, I now see the world in a different way, and I write songs. I feel like I'm writing more songs now that I'm a mother, and that's not what I would have thought. I would have thought that would have maybe, taken my creativity away, or that's the myth that was out there. And it actually like put me on high gear, and I've been creating way more projects than I ever thought. So that's I always think it's really important for an artist to think, what is the thing that you want to talk about that might not have something to do with the current project? That when they say, is there anything else you want to talk about? Or at least just say, yeah, can you please mention my website? Drive traffic where you want them to go, like whether it's Facebook or Instagram or your website. Just make sure you mention it so that they can put that in there, because sometimes they won't think to do that. And that's important for you. That's how you build your audience.
Mm.
There's a very good question. I think in Mojo magazine, which is my favorite publication, and they asked this question at the end: is there something that you've never been asked before in an interview? And that's really cool, because they come up with some really interesting responses on that. So just an idea.
Wow, that's cool.
you could also ask yourself those basic questions and be ready for those answers. I'm always thought of that TV show, I don't remember it, where he asked the same questions to all the people every time he interviewed them. The night of I don't remember the TV show, but it's a famous guy who asked, what will you say to St. Peter after you die? He'd ask the same question to everybody. So you could be prepared with questions like that. What are your influences? Who are your mentors? Where's your music going? What do those basic questions you should be prepared for.
The other thing you should do, like when I get some lead time and I know I'm setting up an interview with somebody, maybe it's next week, I'll Google them, find out who they're writing for, read other articles they've written, so and just so I can get a sense of who they are before I get on the phone with them. Because, if it's a phone conversation for a half an hour about a record that's really personal, I need a level of comfort with the other human being on the other side of the line to talk about, certain songs that I might not want to delve into. So I do a little bit, as much as I can. I try, especially on radio shows. Like if I'm going to be on the radio with somebody live, I want to get on and listen to them the week before, and just so I can get a sense of who they are. Also like I can then listen to them afterwards and enjoy the radio show. So.
Well, we're at the top of the hour, but oh my gosh, thank y'all so much for coming and being a part of this webinar. This was even better than last time, and I'm so glad for everybody that came and listened. I hope you learned something, and stay tuned for our announcement of our next surface sessions. But thank you, Lee Zimmerman, Michael Stock, and Amy Speace.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.
Thanks.
Thank you.